I had been running out of time long before I ever stepped into that mansion. The moment I got the email, I thought it was a mistake. A personal assistant to a billionaire? Sure, I'd been hustling on the side, filling out job applications, working odd gigs, even trying to get freelance work off the ground. But this felt like a scam, like one of those fake job listings meant to lure in desperate souls just to take advantage of them. But my gut told me otherwise. Something in that email felt real. So I ignored the skeptical voice in my head and pressed respond. Before I get into how it all started, let me introduce myself. My name is Eli Winters, a 29-year-old college dropout living in a small apartment on the outskirts of a city that never felt quite big enough for someone like me. I'd made it through a year of business school before deciding that I didn't need a degree to make it. And while I was good with numbers and great at talking myself into opportunities, I hadn't made much headway in life. No steady job, no security, just a constant juggling act between renting late-night spaces in co-working hubs and surviving on cheap takeout meals. I wasn't a loser. At least I didn't feel like one. I just hadn't figured it all out yet. I had a plan, though. I was determined to break through, eventually, to get my hands on something real, something big. I told myself every morning, standing in front of the mirror, that today was going to be the day. But most days, I didn't even believe my own pep talks. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our daily uploads. The email was different. It caught my eye first with the subject line, "Your invitation to join Maximilian Rhodes' team." The name was familiar. Maximilian Rhodes, billionaire entrepreneur, tech mogul, and something of a mysterious figure. I'd heard whispers about him in the business world. He was one of those men whose name was synonymous with power, the kind of man who could single-handedly reshape industries. And now I was being invited to be his personal assistant. The pay? Well, let's just say it would change my life. 10 times what I was making now. Benefits? Unlimited. No job requirements except for trust. The email sounded like an answer to all my problems. The catch? I would have to move to his estate. I should have been suspicious. Everyone in my position would have been. But I wasn't. I was tired. And I needed something, anything, that could get me out of this rut. So I replied, cautiously at first, but soon enough, I found myself at the mansion gates, suitcase in hand, wondering how the hell I'd gotten here. As the gates slowly creaked open, a sense of unease swept over me. It wasn't the kind of place you'd find by accident. This mansion looked like something out of an old Gothic novel, huge, imposing, and pristine. Every inch of it screamed wealth, but there was an unnatural stillness that clung to the air, like the property had been abandoned for centuries and just now resurrected. The moment I stepped out of my cab and looked up at the towering structure, I felt small, insignificant. It wasn't just the building's size, it was the overwhelming presence of the place, the feeling that someone or something was watching. I tried to shake off the jitters as I rang the doorbell. I'd been here for 5 minutes and already felt like I was about to be swallowed whole by whatever this place was. When the door opened, I was face to face with the man himself. Maximilian Rhodes stood before me like a god. Not in a pompous way, not in a way that screamed, "I'm better than you," but in the kind of way where it was clear he was someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Someone who was comfortable in his skin, comfortable with the world, and comfortable with the power he wielded. He was tall, easily 6'4", with dark, almost black hair that was meticulously styled, a sharp jawline that seemed to cut through the air, and eyes that I could never quite read. His gaze was sharp, calculating, but also oddly disarming. He was dressed in an expensive black suit that looked tailor-made for him. Every inch of him radiated control. "Eli Winters," he said, his voice smooth and cold, yet oddly welcoming. "I've been expecting you. Come in." I followed him into the house, my footsteps echoing on the marble floors. The interior was just as you'd expect. Opulent, sleek, and almost too perfect. The air smelled faintly of something floral, maybe jasmine, and I couldn't help but notice how quiet it was. There was no music, no sound of people walking around, nothing. It was the kind of silence that weighed on you. "Please take a seat." Maximilian gestured toward an oversized leather chair in a spacious living room, its windows showcasing the sprawling gardens outside. I sat down, unsure what to say. The reality of it all was sinking in. I was in the home of a man whose wealth and power stretched farther than I could even begin to comprehend. Maximilian didn't waste time. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving me. "I'm sure you have questions, Eli. Let's start with why I've brought you here." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. "I've been looking for someone like you for a while now. Smart, driven, and most importantly, willing to trust. Trust. That was the word he kept using. He said it like it meant something more than just believing in someone. I could tell that whatever trust he was talking about wasn't the same kind I'd extended to a friend. This felt more like a transaction. There are a few rules in this house, Eli. You'll be living here and working here for as long as I see fit. You'll have all the comforts you need, but there are boundaries." Maximilian's tone was calm, almost reassuring. "And one thing you'll quickly realize is that time is something I control. It's crucial you understand that. I've found that managing time, the way you use it, is the key to success, and I expect you to follow certain protocols." My curiosity piqued. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what he meant by all of that. He continued, his gaze intense. "First rule, no clocks. Never ask what time it is. You'll never see a watch on me, and I don't want you wearing one either. You'll know when it's time. Trust me." I didn't quite understand. It felt like a strange, almost philosophical request, but I wasn't about to question a billionaire. Not yet, anyway. "Second," he continued, "meetings will always start and end on my terms, not yours. Not the clocks. My terms. If I say it's time, you stop what you're doing. When I say it's over, it's over. No exceptions." I shifted uncomfortably in my seat. Something about his words, his calm demeanor, was starting to unnerve me. Maximilian leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And lastly, never question the flow of time here. If you follow these rules, things will go smoothly. If not, well, let's just say the consequences can be more severe than you might imagine." I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something. This wasn't just about being a personal assistant. There was something deeper, something more sinister going on. But the money, the opportunities, they clouded my judgment. I forced a smile. "Understood." As I followed him to my new quarters, my mind raced. There were so many questions, so many things that didn't quite add up. But for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was on the verge of something big. Maybe this was my chance to finally escape the cycle of failure. Maybe Maximilian Rhodes really did have all the answers. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something much darker than I realized. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our daily uploads. I didn't know it at the time, but my life was already slipping away from me the moment I walked through Maximilian's front door. It wasn't just the mansion, though the place alone was enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. It wasn't even Maximilian himself, who had an air about him that was both reassuring and suffocating at the same time. No, it was something else, something deeper. Something that lingered in the corners of every room, in the silence of every hallway, in the unnerving quiet of the house that always seemed to be watching. The first few days passed like a dream. Everything was so perfect, so polished. I woke up to breakfast waiting for me at exactly 7 a.m. No alarms, no noise, just a faint sound of someone slipping through the shadows of the mansion before it appeared on my table. The house was equipped with everything I could possibly need, and the staff, who were mostly silent and rarely seen, made sure that my every need was met. I never saw them for more than a moment at a time, and none of them ever looked directly at me. There was always a strange formality to the way they moved, as if they were actors in a play they'd rehearsed 1,000 times. It was all too perfect, too smooth. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid, caught up in the newness of it all. But after a few days, I began to feel something was off. I spent my time doing what I was hired to do: assist Maximilian with meetings, manage his calendar, respond to emails, and take care of little tasks around the mansion. But every time I did, there was this underlying tension, an unspoken expectation that I couldn't quite place. The strangest part? It was all about time. There were no clocks in the house, not one. None on the walls, no wristwatches, no phones, no devices that would tell me what time it was. It was as if time itself was forbidden. At first, I thought it was a quirk of Maximilian's, a statement of power, perhaps. But as the days went by, I realized it wasn't just a preference, it was a rule. Maximilian had warned me that things would be different here, but I didn't fully understand what he meant until I started to lose track of time myself. The first time it happened, I'd been sitting in his office, waiting for him to finish a call. I'd been there for, well, I had no idea how long. The room was large, filled with expensive furniture and art I couldn't even begin to appreciate. But I couldn't focus on any of that. My mind kept returning to the silence around me. The absence of time, the absence of the ticking of a clock. I glanced at my phone. The screen was black, dead. I thought nothing of it at first. I'd charged it that morning. I plugged it in and waited, but it never powered on. A few hours passed, or maybe it was just a few minutes, but when I looked at it again, it still wasn't working. I checked the walls of Maximilian's office. No clocks, no windows to tell me the time of day. No sun, no moon, no sense of passing hours. That's when I started to get a strange feeling. The kind of feeling that makes your skin crawl even in broad daylight. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my nerves, but it wasn't. Later that day, I went to Maximilian's library to pick up a document he'd requested. The library was vast, stretching for what seemed like miles, with rows upon rows of books. I wandered down aisles, lost in the endless sea of leather-bound spines, wondering just how long I'd been walking. I found the document, tucked between two large volumes, and when I looked at the title of the book next to it, I realized I couldn't remember how I'd gotten there. I'd only taken one step forward, then another, yet the time that had passed felt like hours. I took the book and returned to Maximilian's study, where he was sitting behind his desk, as if he had been waiting for me. "How long has it been?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I glanced at the desk, and though there was no clock, I could feel the heavy pressure of time pressing in. "How long have I been gone?" I said, trying to sound casual, though the unease in my voice was unmistakable. Maximilian leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "Time is a tool, Eli, not something to be measured or controlled." He smiled, but there was something unsettling about it, something hollow. "It's only important when you allow it to control you." I didn't understand what he meant, but I nodded, not wanting to appear confused. His gaze softened as he added, "Remember the rules. Time doesn't exist here in the way you think it does. Trust in the flow of things. Time will reveal itself when it's ready." The way he said it, calm, confident, made it sound like something deeper was at play, something I wasn't yet ready to comprehend. But I didn't press him. Not then. Not yet. As the days wore on, the oddities grew harder to ignore. The mansion itself seemed to warp around me. I couldn't remember how long I'd been working for Maximilian. Days? Weeks? Or had it only been a few hours? Each day felt like it stretched on forever, then collapsed into itself, with no clear sense of where one day ended and the next began. I tried to make sense of it, tried to keep track of my own time, but it was impossible. I stopped using my phone. It never worked long enough to be reliable. And the house never offered any answers. I'd sometimes check the large windows, looking for the sunlight to give me some hint of what time it might be, but the sun always seemed to hover in the same place, as if frozen. And then came the dreams. The first dream was benign, or at least it started that way. I woke up in my bed, just like every other morning, the sheets cold against my skin. But when I looked around, something was wrong. The room didn't look the same. It was darker. The furniture slightly rearranged. There were no windows, just the door, which creaked open, revealing the hall. I heard a voice calling me, though I couldn't tell from where. It was faint, distant. "Eli," it said, almost in a whisper, but there was something eerie in the sound of it. I walked down the hall, the mansion stretching endlessly before me. The shadows seemed to stretch with me, as if the entire place was bending, shifting around me, always just out of reach. Then I saw Maximilian. He stood at the end of the hall, watching me. "Eli," he said again, but this time his voice wasn't faint. It was sharp, commanding. I walked toward him, feeling my legs heavy as if I were moving through water. The closer I got, the more the world around me seemed to distort. Time stretched again, or maybe it stopped altogether. But I kept moving forward, knowing that if I stopped, something terrible would happen. When I reached him, he spoke again, this time softer, almost kindly. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you?" His smile was as cold as ever. Before I could respond, I woke up with a start, gasping for breath. My heart pounded in my chest. I couldn't tell if the dreams were just my mind playing tricks or if something deeper was going on. But I knew one thing for sure. This house, this man, Maximilian, had control over more than just time. He had control over me, and I was beginning to wonder if I could ever escape it. The days blurred together, but I knew one thing was true. I was trapped. Trapped in a mansion with no clocks, no windows, and no way to measure the passing of time. Trapped in a world where Maximilian's rules weren't just rules, they were laws. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt myself being pulled under, consumed by the very thing that had drawn me in, time. But what was I supposed to do? It was too late to back out now, too late to leave. So I played by the rules, for now. I had been living in the mansion for what felt like an eternity. Days passed in strange loops, moments stretching and bending in ways I couldn't comprehend. The mansion had swallowed me whole, and I was starting to realize just how deep I'd gotten into Maximilian's world. It wasn't just the house, it was the rules. The unspoken laws that governed every inch of my existence here. There were no clocks, no phones, no windows to mark the passage of time. I began to lose myself in the rhythm of the house, in the strange dance Maximilian controlled. I followed his orders without question, moving from one task to the next like a machine. I wasn't sure if I was even living anymore. Maximilian was everywhere, and nowhere at once. I would see him at odd hours, his sharp gaze following me from the shadows, always watching, always waiting. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, the way he seemed to bend the very nature of time around him. I had become a pawn in his game, and it wasn't long before I realized that the price of playing by his rules was far steeper than I could have imagined. The breaking point came on a Tuesday, or what I thought was a Tuesday. I had been working in Maximilian's study for what felt like hours, but the air around me had grown thick, and my thoughts had begun to feel disjointed. My head was spinning, and I couldn't tell if it was the lack of sleep, the strange feeling that time itself was slipping away, or something else entirely. Maximilian had been in his office when I arrived, his presence looming over me like a constant reminder that I was nothing more than a tool for his desires. I had learned to ignore the unease that gnawed at me every time I entered the room, but that day was different. There was an intensity in the air that I couldn't shake. "Eli," he called from across the room, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. "Come here." I hesitated before stepping forward. Something felt wrong, like I was walking deeper into a trap, but I couldn't figure out why. Maximilian leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped in front of him. His eyes never left mine, his expression unreadable. "You've been with me for a while now, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and measured. I nodded. "Yes. And how do you feel about it?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't like him to ask for feedback. He was always in control, always the one giving orders. I swallowed, trying to keep my composure. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," I replied, though the words felt hollow coming out of my mouth. Maximilian studied me for a moment, as if weighing my response. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on me. "You've been following the rules well, Eli, but I can see it in your eyes. There's something different about you now, something unsettled." I stiffened, my throat tightening. It was true, I couldn't deny it. The longer I stayed here, the more I felt like I was losing myself. But I wasn't about to admit that to him. "I'm fine," I said, my voice shaky. Maximilian's lips curled into a faint smile, but there was nothing comforting about it. "You will be," he said, as if speaking to a child. "But you're not ready yet, Eli. Not yet." I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't have time to question it. Without another word, he stood up and walked toward the door. "Come with me," he ordered. Maximilian led me down a corridor I hadn't noticed before. The walls were lined with dark, intricate tapestries, and the air grew colder as we walked deeper into the mansion. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led into some dark, forgotten part of the house. A place I wasn't supposed to be. We stopped in front of a large, ornate door. It was made of solid oak, with intricate carvings running along the edges. The handle was cold to the touch, and when I reached for it, I felt a strange shiver run through my body. Maximilian opened the door and gestured for me to enter. The room inside was nothing like I expected. It wasn't a study or a library or any of the other places I had seen in the mansion. This room was different. It felt wrong. The walls were lined with shelves, but they weren't filled with books or objects. Instead, they were filled with clocks. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Each clock was different, some large, some small, some ancient, others modern, but they all had one thing in common. They were all frozen. I stepped inside, my eyes widening at the sight. I could feel the weight of the room pressing down on me, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. It was like time itself had been trapped in this room, a museum of moments that never came to be. "What is this place?" I whispered, unable to keep the shock from my voice. Maximilian stood behind me, his presence almost suffocating. "This is where time goes when it's no longer needed." I turned to face him, my mind racing. "What do you mean?" He smiled, but it was colder than before. "Every second you waste, every moment you let slip by, it's collected here. These clocks are the remnants of those lost moments. Time isn't just a concept, Eli. It's a force that can be controlled."